everybody. Nice to see you. You have two Kathryns here. You've got Kathryn with a C, that's me, and you've got Kathryn with a K and a Y. That's Kathryn. But what should we call you, Dr. Kathryn Murray?
Oh, just call me Kathy. Most people just call me Kathy. Thank you.
Okay. Right, we've got that out of the way. I'm often called Kathy too, but work-wise, I tend to be called Kathryn. So,
yeah, I do a bit the same.
It can be quite helpful sometimes.
Yeah.
Welcome, and welcome to everybody for joining us this evening. The idea is that you write in the chat, pose your questions, disagree, put in your own ideas, and we'll be led by you. All right, but let Kathy tell us a little bit about what she does, and because it's fascinating.
Well, thank you, Kathryn, and thank you so much for your invitation to join you in sparkDEBATE. I've been watching with interest as you've been developing this platform, and I know that you have some very valuable conversations with people from around the world. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you too to the people who have joined us today, because I know we're all busy. And I know we've all got other things that we could be doing. So I appreciate your time. And I mean, really, we're all here for the children, aren't we? I mean, that's the bottom line. We all do what we do for the children. And my approach is that I'm just trying to give children the best possible start in life. And that's really what my life purpose, I think, has been. So just a little bit about me. I'm Australian. I'm currently living in America and doing some brain set work and some professional development sessions in America, and I also work online across the world. So I've been in this early childhood education game for about 40 years, and I call it a game because it goes up and down like a roller coaster, round and round. So I call it a bit of a game. So I've been around for 40 years. I've been a classroom teacher for 25 of those years. I've worked in universities, lecturing and mentoring pre-service teachers, so basically teaching people how to be a teacher. I've worked for consultancy organisations all across Australia, working with early childhood educators and teachers in many, many places across Australia and overseas. And then I still work at the university casually, and I just teach online, a course here and there. So I still work with them because I like to keep my hand in with the students, and also that makes me research. It makes me read because I have to be up to date for the lecturing with the students. About 6 years ago, I created my own consultancy organisation, and as I said before, I work across the world supporting and guiding early childhood educators, teachers, people call them different things wherever you are. And I've also done a lot of work with parents as well. So sort of a varied range of things, I guess, in over 40 years. You wouldn't you?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, we do. And Kathryn and I were talking the other day about my brain set environments formula that I've created. And she asked how that came into being. And just really briefly, for your interest, I had things swimming around in my head for all of the time that I'd been in the classroom and lecturing at university and being involved in many, many teachers' classrooms across Australia. And so I had, and across the world too, online. And I had all of these ideas about why we should be aligning the needs of the child's brain with the environment that we set up. And I had all these little jigsaw pieces in my brain, and a colleague of mine sent me an article to read, and it was actually about setting up an environment to support children with autism. And I read this article. I was in a coffee shop, and it dawned on me that I've got it. All of these pieces started fitting together. So I had a napkin or, serviette, depending on what you call them. I don't know what you call them in.
And it's not a fag pocket.
No, it wasn't that. So I was scribbling on this piece of paper at the coffee shop and doing all these visuals and these diagrams, and the brain set environments formula was born. everything sort of fell into place, and I designed 3 pillars of design, and within those pillars of design are 16 elements of design that should be overlapped throughout the child's learning environment. So I developed all of that, well, partly in the coffee shop, and the rest I did at home when I got home. And this has developed now into a whole pedagogy. So it's a whole way of teaching. It's not just where you put the furniture, it's how you speak to the children. I've developed planning documents, assessment documents that all go together. And it's not meant to be an add-on to anything that people are currently doing. It's just a way of teaching. So it's a whole process, and it's good teaching practice, but it not only considers the normal developmental domains that we all work with, it also really aligns and enhances and harmonizes the brain development that's going on in young children. Because, you know, there's still about 90% of brain development that happens in those first 5 years. So the environment we set up for the children is just so vital. It's like the biggest thing.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, we are more keyed into the children's brains than we were 5, 10, 15 years ago. But we think about child development, and we don't actually think about brain development. You know, we don't have, you know, we have our 7 areas of learning in our EYFS in the UK. There's no mention of brain development as such in the EYFS. As far as I know, somebody can correct me if they like. But we don't really think about that enough. And it's good that we're having these conversations now around the brain. So you have this saying, don't you, about the calm brain as a learning brain?
The calm brain is a thinking brain. Close.
Thinking brain. Okay.
The calm brain is a thinking brain because as you said in your little introduction there, Kathryn, and thank you for that, the SET in brain set stands for the survival part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, and the thinking part of the brain. So if we can align these 2 parts of the brain by overlapping my design elements, well, then this part of the brain can shine. You know, the thinking is clearer, the memory is clearer, decision making is clearer, communication happens a lot easier. Everything flows. But we need to make sure that the survival part of the brain has that sense of safety. We need to make sure that the emotional part of the brain feels safe and feels that sense of belonging and being wanted and valued and all of those great things that we want for our children. And then we've got a calm brain. So then we can have a thinking brain. Now the little, I guess, chink in the armor there is when children are experiencing trauma or have experienced trauma. Same with the adults that are working in the room. So what I'm talking about with the harmonizing of the brain is also applicable to the adults that are in the room. But we need to remember that there's a huge flood of cortisol into the brain when children are triggered or they've had traumatic events. It doesn't take much to trigger that back, and then the cortisol floods this top part of the brain, the thinking part of the brain, and then we don't have a calm brain and we don't have a thinking brain. We have a functioning brain. We can do a certain number of things, but memory's not so great. We can't articulate so well. Our self-regulation isn't so great. So all of those things are affected when, you know, a traumatized brain is triggered. So we have to make sure we have things in their environment too that are going to try and alleviate that and calm that and bring that right down.
Okay. Right. So in my nurseries, we used to play, I say used to because I've just sold my last one, play inside, we used to call it inside out music. And it was all around, we used to call it the reptilian brain. This is the reptilian brain, tight brain. The one that the snake, you know, that would bite you rather than stay around. The idea was that the outside, the classroom, the outdoor classroom was the best classroom to be in. But obviously, especially when it's cold in the UK, we can't always be outside. And therefore, we used to bring the outside in. So we, you know, the environments were calmly decorated with magnolias. Not well, I particularly like magnolias. Magnolia and neutral colours, and we used to have big plants. So we had big plants for the children, and you can see some of those in some of our videos actually. And we used to play this music from 7:30 when the nursery opened to 10:30 in the morning, and it would be all different. We used to rotate the discs.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be CDs. We used to rotate the discs. So sometimes it would be, you know, farmyard noises. Sometimes it would be the sea or water, the rain, or even the wind, actually. Although sometimes I think the wind can fire children up a bit. But
yeah, I think so.
All natural noises. And we just used to play it in the background. And we found, actually, that the whole nursery calmed down. You know, anxious parents dropping their children off because they were going to be late, etc. You know, they had a taste of it as they walked through. The staff had it and the children had it. And it actually, I really do believe that it calmed that part of the brain.
Yeah, the reptilian part.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, well, I've been involved in bush kindergartens, which is, you know, outside kindergartens a little as well. And the dynamics and the way children play and who they play with and the learning experiences that they create and become involved in outside are very different to what happens on the, you know, inside the four walls. So, you know, bringing the outside in and the inside out, I think is
and the other way as well. We used to take our internal resources outside, so they would have tables and chairs outside as well as inside.
Yeah, yeah. And that's really important for us to remember that nature is the most calming thing that we all have. You know, if we're having a bad day, if we just walk outside for a while, it makes a big difference. Yeah, take a breath, stand in the sunshine if it's sunny, even if it's not, just having the fresh air on your face makes a huge difference. And it's no different for children. And I think that's sometimes as adults we forget that. We forget that children are actually people, and you know, the same things affect them. I did some training in Australia with BrainSet, and the first stage of the training, like the first module, is all about the brain and attachment theory and building relationships, and but very much about these levels of the brain and what that means for children and what that means for we as teachers. And the next week I came back, and then the next week is all about, okay, we've got this understanding about our brain now. So what does that mean for how we set up our environment, and what are we going to do, and how are we going to do it, and these design pillars and the elements, and, you know, how are we actually going to do this. But before I got started on the second week of training, one of the educators from the 2-year-old room said, she had this big smile on her face, and I said, "You look like you've had a really good week." And she said, "I've had the best week." She said, "I cannot believe the changes in my room." I said, "Well, what have you done? We haven't even talked about what to do in your room yet." And she said, "I just made a couple of little changes based on what you told us about the brain last week." And she said, "I couldn't believe it." She said, "These 2-year-olds were more engaged. They stood or stayed at the learning experiences that she had placed around the room much longer." She said everybody was calmer, and because everybody was calmer, we adults could talk to each other. We were calmer, so we talked to each other about the children, about different provocations that we could add, different things that we could maybe take away or change over the week. And she said, and you said don't go in and just change everything around. So she said we didn't. We just changed, you know, a little bit here and there. But she said I couldn't believe the difference. And I thought to myself, wow, I can't either, because that's just really amazing that they made these little changes, and the children reacted so positively, and so did the adults. So it's all about well-being too. So whilst we're talking about creating an environment for learning, it's actually an environment for well-being too, and reducing the stress level. And that's why my mantra, a calm brain is a thinking brain. So I often say to people whenever I do a presentation about BrainSet, that if you remember nothing else from what I've said, please remember a calm brain is a thinking brain, because you know, if you can remember that and put that into place, that's going to make all the difference in your rooms with the children and with you.
I mean, we were talking about, before we came on air, as it were, we were talking about toddlers and how challenging toddlers could be. Somebody's listening who's works in a toddler room, And I'm a firm believer that how you arrange a room and the resources that you add to the spaces in the room are really important. That's something that we advocate through our software in every respect. It's a teacher, the environment. And so tell us a bit more about the ideal environment then. Well, we've got toddlers and we've got childminders and we've got deputy manager doing level 5. What sort of things should we be thinking about?
Okay, so I want us all to sort of imagine a child at home all day, and not in a centre, not in a school, not in a classroom, but a child that's at home with their parents. And now in that home environment, there's probably maybe 8 rooms within the box, right? So the box is the house. There's probably about 8 rooms, and each one of those rooms is purposely designed, and things are intentionally placed in those spaces. So in the bedroom, there's a purpose for that, and the beds are intentionally placed in the room in a certain location. There might be some toys there, whatever is in that room. Think about now the living space, the living room or lounge room. Think about the purpose of that space. Think about the bathroom area. Think about the kitchen. They all are purposely designed for a particular level of skill development. Now, if we can transfer that sort of concept into our learning environment, into our classroom situation, and outside as well, because the concept goes both ways. And we try and divide our room up into smaller defined spaces in our rooms. That's going to make a huge difference to the children. To start with, it's a lot more interesting than just one big space with, we've got a puzzle table.
I call that church hall syndrome, when it's one huge space and children just run from one corner to the other.
Well, that's the invitation, isn't it? When there's things spaced around the room, and I've got plenty of stories about that, about people saying, I don't know why the children are just running through my room. Mm-hmm. It's because everything is placed either around the outside or in the middle, and there's these beautiful big corridors, there's these beautiful big running lanes through the room. And but because people are in it, and they're there every day, they don't see it sometimes. It's we're all guilty of that, the forest for the trees sort of concept. So to have someone else come in and make some observations is really helpful, whether it's peers or whether it's a consultant like you and I. That can make the world of difference. But if we imagine that the learning space has got multiple small defined spaces, could be 10 defined spaces in a learning environment, and they're divided off in such a way that the children are focusing on different skills or the same skills but with different materials in each of those spaces. That gives them the opportunity to repeat, elaborate.
Okay, that's really interesting, because I would say in the UK we do have learning spaces within our environments. It's part and parcel of the EYFS, I feel. But we tend to plan for different sorts of play in each of those areas, and not necessarily the same skills. We're not actually, I don't think we necessarily think about, we might take literacy into the garage area with clipboards for the boys, to make tally or bring in some maths. But I don't think we really think about how to encourage the same skills that we're looking for in each of those areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make perfect sense. And we don't have time for me to go into everything in detail, obviously. but the broad brushstroke is that we have these multiple defined spaces in our rooms, and we're thinking of not so much about making it look good and making sure we have the construction space, the art space, the literacy space, the reading, which are the standard things. And we do include those, but when we're including those and a range of other ones that, I can share with you soon, we're thinking about the skill that's going to be developed in those spaces. So if you're in the 2-year-old room, it maybe you're really focusing on all the children to have social and emotional skills. Maybe you're wanting them to self-regulate. Maybe you're wanting them to be able to enter play by saying, "Can I play?" If they're articulate enough. We're looking at the skills. Older children, maybe we're looking at fine motor skills. Maybe for the 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, whatever, our focus might be on social and emotional, but we also might be focusing on fine motor and literacy skills perhaps. So in the brain set environment, you would have these multiple spaces, and in the spaces you would have something in there that's going to draw the children in, that invites the children in, and that's going to be based on their interests, because no one's going to go somewhere that they're not interested in what's there. So why would you? Think about shopping. Let's put it out there. When you go shopping and you're walking around a shopping mall, you're looking at the shops, and unless you see something that's of interest to you, you're not going to go into the shop, right? It's the same thing. It's the same thing in our learning environment. So let's say, in your classroom, there's a lot of children that are interested in the beach. So you might put some books in each space that's about the beach, or you might put some about farm animals and, mix it up a little bit. You would have books in each of the spaces, because the underlying thing is that we want to create a love of literacy. So we would be having those clipboards that you mentioned, Kathryn, and the books, the storybooks, in all of the spaces related to the space, so related to different things. You might have 2 art spaces. It might be in one space, it might be the easels, so it's a vertical painting, and another space it might be on the table, so it's a horizontal painting approach. But in those 2 areas, you might have different things. So you might have paintbrushes at the easels, fat paintbrushes, but over on the table, you might have fine paintbrushes. But in both of those places, you're working on your fine motor skills. You're just doing it in a different way. Over in the construction space, and you might have a couple of construction spaces, because we really only want to have a maximum of maybe 4 children in each of the spaces, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But in the construction spaces, you might have 2 of those. In one of the spaces, you might also have we call them Lego or Mobilo or something like that. Some of those, snap things, you'll know, you're familiar in your own context, but you might have those in with the construction, with the blocks. But in the other construction space, you might have some wooden people, you might have the stop signs, the go signs, a set of those over in the construction space. Again, we're using the fine motor skills, because we're using the manipulative things in that construction space, and then you're picking up the small things and the signs, whatever, in the other construction space. 2 different construction spaces with different books, the clipboards, so that children can either do pretend writing or real writing, or draw a plan, or have an idea about what they're going to do. And again, that's fine motor, right? Turning the pages of a book, fine motor. So we're thinking about the skills. We're drawing the children in with their interests and setting up the spaces with great provocations, open-ended materials, but the purpose is the skills. Now, the other thing is, when they're in smaller spaces like this, they feel less threatened. So we're going here to the brainstem. They're feeling less threatened because there's only 1 or 2, maybe 3 other children in these little spaces. So oral language increases because they're not feeling as threatened. The learning that they do is more focused, and because there's multiple small engaged groups, it frees up the educator to be able to go around to these smaller spaces and have these great conversations with small groups of children, or it could be just 1 child in a space or 2 children in a space. But it's a different combination that educators can move around and facilitate the learning and ask these, really interesting questions with the children, and actually get to know the children really well, because you're dealing with smaller groups of children in the room.
Yeah, we tend to call the aims, the skills that you're talking about, next steps in the UK. So when we're planning, we'd be looking at what would be the possible next steps for each of the children, which could be very different. 1 2-year-old might be quite good at taking turns, whereas another one is still snatching. And there might be some children, approaching 3 that are beginning to think about sharing. Sorry, I have a cat behind me. This is Storm. He's generally on my lap. He's not generally behind me. And so we would modify what we were doing with the child's learning needs in mind. I'm just throwing that in there because I don't feel, as talking to settings on a daily basis in my role, because we don't just pass the software over, we actually have a relationship with people. It's a sort of consultancy along the side. A lot of practitioners don't really think about what they hope the child's going to gain. I mean, they might not, the child might take them off on a different tangent, but they don't have anything in their mind about what the child's going to really gain. They're more focused on the activities they'd like to be providing, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, so I think that comes back to the role of the teacher, and it also comes back to the image of the child that the teacher has. So if you have the image that children are competent, capable, creative human beings, then you will offer open-ended materials and allow them to achieve whatever they want to achieve. So in a brain set classroom, there is a range of entry points into each space, because the spaces are carefully planned. There's a planning pro forma planning document that I guide people through, and at the bottom of that is also evaluation of children's learning. So it is monitoring the children's learning, so we can do exactly what you just said, what next with this particular child, and we monitor that over a couple of weeks and work out the next step with those children. But we use that planning document to carefully curate the different learning spaces that we have within the room. And because we carefully plan it, and because the materials are open-ended materials, then we're trying to encourage creativity and problem solving and decision making and collaboration and all of those non-threatening approaches to their learning. The child that's gifted, and just as a bit of an aside, there's about, in a centre or a school, there's usually a percentage of children who are gifted, and there's many times teachers say, oh, I don't need to know about gifted children. We don't have any gifted children here. And sometimes I think it's because you don't know what to look for, because it's maybe something that hasn't been in your training. And I've done a bit of work around that too, and written quite a few articles around gifted children. So sometimes I think
that's where it's really important. But that's where it's really important to keep careful records, as far as I'm concerned. And there's been a really push, because Ofsted don't require it to be seen. There's been a real push away from keeping records. I think a lot of settings feel they don't need to do it anymore. I personally disagree with that for lots of different reasons, because you can't meet the child's needs, and if you don't have it in some sort of shape or form recorded, somebody just walks off with that knowledge about that child. The child moves rooms, they lose that member of staff, they don't have that knowledge, and therefore children who are doing really well can be overlooked, and then they can become a bit of a pain, can't they? Because they find other things to be interested in, and that's possibly nipping the child beside them, or being a nuisance.
That there is that aspect to it. So if we carefully plan the spaces, a child that's gifted can go into those spaces and create something amazing. But also the child that perhaps isn't gifted, or in the normal range, or even at the lower end of what you would expect milestone wise and developmentally, they can still access the learning in these learning spaces, because we've carefully curated them, and to make sure that there's an entry level for all of the children. And that comes back to really great planning. But before the planning, we have to have the relationships developed with the children, so you actually know the children. And that comes back to understanding their brain development as well, and how to connect with these children. So you see, it's all linked with their interests, with the brain development, with the general, developmental domains, the environment, the way we set up the environment. And something I just wanted to mention about having multiple defined spaces in the room. And there's a whole, there's like elements that we need to put into each of these spaces and into the room in general that we probably won't have time to go into. But there's a lot of soft skills that are learned as well, because if there's a small space for, let's say, 4 children in the construction space, and a 5th child comes over and wants to engage, if there's not enough space there, that child has to wait. Waiting is good, because that is building resilience. And also it builds communication skills, because that child, with the facilitation of the teacher, can negotiate with the children who are in the space. Can you come and get me when you leave the space? I'd like to play here too, but there's not enough room, or whatever the conversation might be. But it encourages that social and emotional growth. But the biggest thing is that they have to wait. And, in this day and age, most of our children across the world, because I work everywhere, across the world, want things right now, immediately, and can't understand why they can't have things immediately. So if we can teach them resilience, if we can teach them how to wait, if we can teach them how to turn take and be considerate of other children, they're great life skills. And as we know, with the advent of AI and all of this talk, I don't know what it's been like for you in England.
Yes, we're talking about it all the time at the moment.
Yeah,
I actually went to me. Well, I'm not going to talk about that now, but it's
so we need to give the children the skills that AI can't have. So that
which is the creativity part
and the imagination.
Because whatever we're asking AI to do for us, we have to be creative in asking. If we're not creative in asking, then we're not actually going to get from the AI what perhaps is going to be recognized by algorithms. If it's marketing, it's not going to be recognized, or it's not going to really meet our needs.
Yeah.
So, I'm not really into the soft skills part, because I think soft skills are overlooked. We tend to make judgments socially about children's academic life because they're easy to measure, and actually that might get them the job interview, but it's not necessarily going to get them the job. If that makes sense.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. And along with that, of course, we're embedding those literacy and numeracy skills, and all of the normal academic skills are coming along with that. But setting up a brain set classroom also facilitates. You can't help but not learn the soft skills, basically, and a lot of good.
Sorry, Kathy. Going back to waiting. Lining up. I've got a thing about lining up in early years. I don't think children in early years should be lining up for the adults' convenience.
Well, that's the thing. Who's it for? The child.
And sometimes you see. I've seen in early years settings, there's only 4 people allowed, but there's no conversation. It's a sort of a rule. But doing it this way makes it very natural, doesn't it? It makes it normal. It's not put upon the child. It's the situation they arrive at. It's almost
the child has to use their own common sense. There's not enough space. If there's only 2 chairs at a table with that's facing the wall, and it's got a lot of sensory experiences on the table, and maybe some mirrors on in front of the child, and you've carefully set it up, and there's only 2 chairs there. Well, it's common sense. Only 2 people could be here. So there's no rule that only 2 people can be there, but it's obvious that there's only 2 people can be there. And we have this attention to detail. So there might be the 2 chairs, then we might have a tablecloth over the table, then we might have a table runner, then maybe we have placemats, 2 placemats. And on those placemats are 2 bowls of, I don't know, beads to sort, or whatever it is that the skill that you're trying to develop. But it's that attention to detail. So everything is set up in a way that is inviting, and aesthetically pleasing. So in BrainSet, I've taken bits and pieces from Reggio Emilia, Steiner, Montessori. I've looked at Froebel's work, Vygotsky, Piaget. I've looked at, a bundle of work, and my own 25 years of being in the classroom and trialing all of this stuff myself, and then working with the student teachers and in the classrooms that they go into. And one of the tasks was to set up a space, an environmental space for them, for the children. And so talking with the student teachers has really clarified all of this in my own mind and how it works.
See, in my settings, as a practitioner now, I would do this differently. I'm not disagreeing with anything you've said, and it's really interesting. But I would take where the child prefers to play, and then I would look at what do they need to learn next? What am I hoping the child's going to learn next? And then I would put the resource or the experience into that area, which is the opposite way round in a way.
Well, it sort of is, but it's sort of not too, because we initially set up the spaces from our professional educated judgment, because we're all professionals and we know our children and we know the resources that we've got available. So we know the interests of the children. So we set up the spaces accordingly. And then through observation, Kathryn, you might add in some more things, or you might take out some of those things. A little story. I was in a school in Western Australia, which is, I live on the east coast of Australia and this is on the west. So this is like 6 hours plane flight or something like that. And I went into a classroom, and it was really well set up. But the teacher had 2 tables end to end, so it was a long table. And she had some screening up, and she'd made it defined, and it was all good. And she had 2 placemats. So I'm sorry, 4 placemats, because it was a double table. So 4 placemats, and she had plants across the back, and it looked nice. And she said, the kids don't seem to use this space, and I don't know why. I've set it up. They use everywhere else in the space, but in the room, but they don't really use this space. So I said to her, so what is the purpose of this space? What are you wanting them to do? And she didn't have an answer. She said, well, I'm not sure. So I said, what skills are you wanting to encourage children to use in this space? And she said, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that. Now, when I looked at the space, I thought if I was a child, I put myself in the child's shoes, and I thought if I was a child, I wouldn't know what to do here. There was no paper, there were no pencils, there was just the plants were set up, and those placemats were there. So you could do something at this table, but it hadn't been thought through as to how can she invite the children into this space, and how can she give them a bit of a clue as to what they might be able to do in that space. Whether they do that or whether they don't, that's irrelevant. But there was no clue really as to what could happen in that space. And so coming back to your point, you do add things into the space that are going to draw the children in and are going to impact their interests, and also foster the skills and develop the skills that you've already predetermined that we need to build on. And generally you can, like I said before, the fine motor skills, that's for all children. So you'd be putting things in there that they're going to be developing their fine or their gross motor skills. And then you might refine it even more for particular children. So there might be 5 children that are really starting to count. So you might put some counting things in, and, that zone of proximal development with Vygotsky, if the more skilled other helps the other children, sort of almost like peer tutoring. So you can add different things like that, because
that's the other thing. With the 2 chairs, you could have a watcher. So you could have children who are not actually participating in the activity, but who are actually observing other children using those resources, couldn't you? That would be
That's right. And with the tracking method that is part of BrainSet, you also notice those children who fly under the radar. They might be the watcher. They might just wander around and watch, but they don't actually engage in anything. But with the sort of the tracking process that I've developed, those little children that fly under the radar. It might be that quiet little girl, at the end of the day, you say, was she even here today? Didn't even notice her all day. We've all done that, because they just fit in. and we don't notice them so much. So they're the ones we want to track as well, to make sure that they're engaging. Now, also, when we have this learning experiences time in our rooms, it's important for us to understand that children will wander. Generally, they'll wander for the first 10 minutes or so. They'll just wander around the places and the spaces. And then they might engage for about 20 minutes in one or more spaces, and then they'll wander again. They'll just wander around. And that's fairly standard. And that's okay. And when I'm talking about the defined spaces, it's not a rotational thing. It's not like there's little groups of children where we all move, we ring a bell, 10 minutes and we all move.
I've seen that happen.
Me too. And that's not what BrainSet is. It's the way you set up the room. It's the whole learning environment, and it stays like that all day. If you need to use the tables, you pack away the things that are on the tables in a basket, and then you put them back after you've finished using the tables for eating, if that's what you have to do. And maybe you add some additional provocations for the next set of, inside learning experience time. So, there's a range of different things that I'm trying to fit in and talk to you.
We're right. Let's see. Come on, people on that are listening. What's your view? What do you do? Can you see this working in your settings? It's really interesting, isn't it?
I'd love to know if you have any questions. I'd be really happy to answer any questions that you have, or just even if you want to share some of your own experiences that have worked well.
It's making me think about things in a different sort of way, which is good. It's good. But what about people? Come on, somebody be brave. The chat's not shared on the film. We'll just talk around it.
So the other thing to be mindful of is when you're setting up the classroom is the brain and the brain development. So the brain doesn't do boring things. So if you just have a whole stack of tables with nothing on them, and you might have a dramatic play space over in that corner, and you might have a reading couch or something over in the other corner, and then the rest are just all tables on one level. The brain sees that as a little boring because it's not changing, it's not dynamic enough. So that's where you get behavior issues. That's where you get the children, in the running lane, the running corridor, because it's not engaging enough. But if you set up the room so that it's sort of almost like a zigzag approach, and we call it wayfinding. So wayfinding is a term meaning that children know how to get from one space to the next easily, and that helps that sense of safety down here in the survival part of the brain, in the brainstem. If we align it to us, when we go shopping, we go to a big shopping centre and someone says, I'll meet you at the coffee shop, and they drop you off at the front door of the shopping centre, and you've never been there before. And so you stand at the door and you think, well, where's the coffee shop? I've got 10 minutes to find it. So you're looking around, you don't know where to go. You try to find a sign to show you where to go, and you might see one sign that says coffee shop this way. So you go to the sign and you go that way, and then you're looking for the next little cue to help you get to the coffee shop. During that time, there's a certain level of anxiety because you don't really know where you're going. You feel a little insecure and a little unsure of where you're going. It's the same for children in our rooms. If we don't make it clear, and a lot of us put bookshelves up thinking we're defining and blocking off spaces. We put these bookshelves up. But if you're 3 foot tall and you're a meter, and let's try it on our knees. If you go into your rooms tomorrow, get onto your knees and have a look around at your room on your knees. So if children come in the door and the first thing they see is a brick wall, well, then they don't know where to go. And it's the same as us, that same feeling of us being dumped in a shopping centre and said, find the coffee shop.
Yes, that's it. I'm guilty of that big time. Because I feel that children need that security of not seeing what's across the room, going back to my Churchill syndrome, to keep them there that little bit longer rather than moving them through. It's certainly in the majority of my nurseries. I had one that was in a porter cabin, and it's really worried me because most of the buildings I had actually designed. So I'd actually bought the building and changed the insides of it to make it practical and interesting. So most of my rooms were not rectangles or square. I think this room was well, it was rectangle, but so I actually made a contraption that went across the room like that. It was and it split, so we had learning spaces in each of these quadrants, and then we also had learning spaces around the outside. And in that scenario, it was quite easy for the children to move from one area to another. But in the others, I'm not so sure if it was, because it was more partitioned by furniture, which was less open, I suppose.
Well, think about you know, those shelving units that you can get, that they're just cubes basically. They don't have a back to them. They're just really, you know, cubes. Maybe 4. You can get them in all different shapes and designs. Imagine if you're a child and you're only this tall, and you're in a room and you're looking to go to the next space, and you see this defined space, but it's made, the definition is made by those cubes. So you can sort of see the new space, but you can also see through. So you can see if there's anybody there. Okay. You can see how to get there, rather than if it was just a blank back of shelving where you don't know what's on the other side. Now, children who have experienced trauma, that's very scary for them, because they don't know where they're going. It's the unknown, and it's these little things that we don't think about, I think, as adults, until you start looking at what's going on in the child's brain. So if we can make sure that they can see where to go to the next place and to the next place, and how to move through the room, it adds a lot more security to those children, and helps with this whole calm brain notion that we're talking about. So could I just...
Everybody's going to IKEA this weekend.
But this is the thing, you don't, that's the other thing that I wanted to mention. A lot of people say to me, oh yeah, but we can't afford to buy all this new furniture. You don't have to. You just can repurpose and adapt what you already have. I know there's a centre in the States here, and another consultant that I know was working with this team, and she was rummaging through their storeroom, and she found a big table, like a adult-sized dining table, and she brought that into the room and put it up against the wall, and like out from the wall, so the narrow end was against the wall. And on the back side of it, she went and got some looked like a mirror, but it was like, I don't know what it was, polished plastic or polished stainless steel, I don't know what it was, but she put that against, you know, running down the long side of the table, and the rest of it she just put cushions and things and puzzles and things inside, and made like a cubby house. Okay. And we call that psychological containment or psychological safety, because it's small, it's low, we've lowered the ceiling line, so children are feeling safer and more secure. So that was just repurposing something that she found out the back. You can also...
Did she do that? Because I would say, I mean, that would suit children with a particular schema as well. You know, those that want to envelop everything, you know, want to play under tables, etc.
It's all, yeah.
It's come into your methodology of your
schemas do, because it's you know, it's often you know, the whole bracketing of practices, or bracketing of beliefs, I guess, or bracketing of skills that children are used to doing. But it's also, if we're talking about brain development, we're talking about this psychological stuff, this psychological containment or safety.
No, I just see a scheme, a child's scheme, as safety. You know, I learn this way, and it's repetitive, and I feel comfortable about doing it this way. Whereas if I'm asked to do it a different way, then that's more scary, because that doesn't go with the grain, as it were. That's what I was thinking.
So in a brain set environment, we encourage children to do things over and over and over and over and over and over again, because that is adding to their executive functioning skills, and that's how children learn. That's how we learn. You cook a meal, you cook it over and over, and it gets better and it gets better and it gets better, until in the end you don't need the recipe anymore, right? So it's the same sort of thing with children. You know, they repeat, elaborate. Now the elaborate is us putting in an additional thing into that space to add to their skills. So they might be following their own schema. They might be doing things over and over again until they learn, but it's up to us in our professional judgment then to put in something additional so that they can extend their range of skills. Or it could be, and we've all had this happen in our rooms, there's those, a couple of boys that always go to the construction space and they build the tall tower or they build a long road and they have the train going on the train track or whatever it might be. Every single day they're over there doing the same thing over and over and over and over, to the point where other children aren't getting a turn in the construction space because those couple of boys are doing it all the time. So that's okay to allow that to happen. I'll come back to something else I want to add to that in just a sec. But if we added something into that space then, so let's say we now put some construction books in there and we get a big piece of paper so we can draw a plan for their construction. So we're elaborating now. And that's something that we can do and facilitate with those children because it's just a small little group, maybe 4 boys, maybe 4. I say boys because often that's the way it is. But we could also have another construction space in another area of the room for another 4 children. So even though these 2 or 4 are consistently going to that same space, it doesn't mean everybody else misses out too, because we've got another construction space on the other side of the room, another little space for 3-4 children, and we've got a few different materials in that construction space. We might have our blocks, but we've also got something else over there, as I mentioned earlier. So we want children to repeat, but it's our professional judgment as to when we add something else. Or we might say to those boys, oh, I bought some books for you from my house because I know that you like to build these roads all the time. It's over here in the reading space. Come with me and I'll show you. So then you're dragging them from that construction space into the reading space. You sit with them, they read books with you, and you're demonstrating that, there's actually another space in the room that you could use.
Yeah.
So, that gives that sense of safety and comfort then, because they have made that link between what they were doing and to something new that you've introduced.
That's interesting, because we do have children that like to play in the same area all the time.
And that's okay. But we seem to get.
I think it's very important that children practice things, and I've seen one particular setting used to change their room totally every week. Their home corner would be in a totally different place. Their puzzles would be in a totally different place. I still think it's horrendous to do that to children. I think they need to know where to find things, and they need that comfort of being able to go back to that jigsaw and do it in the same, sitting in the same place or sitting on the floor in the same place, doing the same puzzle if they want to do it.
Yeah, and when I talk to people about that, and I said, if they want to change their room around, well, they've got to have a reason first, not just because, I'll just come in on the weekend and change it all. But if there's a reason, so maybe the dramatic play area isn't working so well down there in the corner. Maybe you need to put it more in smack bang in the middle of the room. Perhaps you need to do that for some reason. And that's okay, you can do that. But when we change our room around, you're right, Kathryn, I agree with you, that we don't change the whole room. You might change 1 or 2 areas. You might swap them over. You could do it in conjunction with the children. You could talk to the children about it.
I think.
Or you can do it and then show the children. There's different ways that you could do it. Because again, I bring it back to an adult context. What if you came into your office tomorrow morning and I'd been in overnight and completely changed it around, and I've moved all your books, I've moved the filing cabinet, your phone is now over on the other shelf, all of those things, you'd come in and you'd be a bit thrown off, and you'd probably be a little mad because I've moved all of your things. So some children really thrive on that. They like the adventure, like, oh, it's new, it's interesting. Some children, it really throws them, and it doesn't help with that sense of safety and that sense of security that we're trying to calm down here. And they now feel insecure, and they now feel like, oh, I don't know what to do. So their confidence level drops because we've done the big change. So anyone who's listening, and I've done that too. When I was in the classroom, I've done the big change, but I now know that a small changes or small little increments is much better. Sometimes you don't have to change the room around at all. If it's working, don't change it at all. Just change what's in the spaces. Add different provocations, take some things out. That dramatic play space that you had set up as a camping area, that might change into a restaurant because the interests change, but you haven't changed the location of the dramatic play space.
I'm wondering if anybody on the chat uses the leuvenscales, the involvement scales, to evaluate their environments, and whether, I think you can have all these tools under the sun, but you do something with them afterwards. There's not much point in recording information if they're not actually used in a constructive way after it's been gathered. But does anybody use those in their setting? Or, do you evaluate your setting? Here we go. Sometimes we use leuvenscales, but we find that schema play is very informative on what the children need. Yeah, I think they both have a good part to play.
Yeah, and different people relate to different things. So both of those are really important ways. And I'm just happy that there's some consideration there, that you're looking at different ways to set up your environment. And I hope maybe I've spurred everybody to start thinking about the development of the brain as well. I hope so.
Yes, I think so. Anybody got any questions they'd like to put to Kathy, or me for that matter? Anything that's struck you this evening? Please participate.
So I think if you think of something after this session and you want to contact me, I'm really happy for you to do that too. My website
details. It's all right. It's coming up in the next bit.
All right, sure. So I'm really happy for anyone to contact me if you'd like to. And as Kathryn said,
okay. Ofsted visits cause enormous stress. No one can think. Okay. I think Ofsted's all about, I'm an ex-Ofsted inspector, and I have had 4 outstanding settings at one time, and I'm sure there are people, I know there are people on the chat that have had outstanding settings. Ofsted inspections are all about doing what you normally do and being confident in what you normally do. But I can help people with that if they want to contact me. I've got lots of mini training and resources that I can let you have access to. But I think if the adults are stressed, then the children are going to be stressed, unfortunately.
I think if you have good practices within your room and you're confident about what's happening in the rooms, and you have you can justify what's happening in the rooms, you have reasons, research-based reasons for what you're doing, I think you're in a good place, because what we're talking about here is good teaching practice. In Australia, we have an organisation like Ofsted, they're called a CEQA, and they do much the same thing. They've got rules and regulations and standards, and they come and do assessments, and the same sort of idea as your Ofsted. And people get all bent out of shape about that and worried about that, and because it is quite a process.
And also, unfortunately, there's a lot at stake as well. If it doesn't go well, you're stuck with it for at least 6 months, if not a year. And if you don't get the grade, if you're wanting outstanding and you only get good, you have to put up with that for almost 6 years. You could possibly put up with that for a long time. But going back to the comment that's just been put, I wish there were they've been sending inspectors in with no experience of under 2s and unreasonable expectations. I think that all comes down to your learning walk. It's about making sure the Ofsted inspector understands what your intent is and how you're putting that into practice and what the impact is. And you can explain all that, in a learning walk if you're clever at it. But again, it's about being confident about what you do and able to articulate what you do. And also, as practitioners, going back to what Kathy was saying, really knowing your children really well, because the inspector won't know them. You know, there's no way an inspector can make a judgment on a child's development, you know, in the little time that they have. They, you know, they need to rely on you to give them that information. So I hope that helps you. Right. So anybody else got any comments or any questions? So the brain then. So we think of child development. Are we really thinking about brain development? That's something we need to think about, I think, and how it's so important to get that right. Probably before, well, child's not going to learn if they're stressed, are they? Basically.
Well, limited learning. You know, they will learn, but limited learning.
They learn to cope.
Well, you know, think about it when, you know, again, I go to an adult analogy. When you're under a bit of stress, you feel a little threatened. You've got to have a conversation with somebody, and you're feeling a little threatened, or the conversation starts to go pear-shaped, and they start to be a little bit more assertive than you're ready for. And you walk away and you think, oh, I should have said that, or I meant to say that, or that would have been a really good example to prove my point. You know, you walk away and you think about it, and we've all done that, right? And everyone on the chat, I'm sure you've done that.
Yeah, as soon as we stop, they'll be saying, oh, I hadn't thought about that, or I hadn't thought about that. So come back to us, folks, please.
That's right. So we all do that. And that's because that level of cortisol increases in our brain because we're trying to protect ourselves. And so whilst we can still function in that conversation, we're not as effective. And that's what happens with children who are, you know, have experienced trauma, and adults who have experienced trauma, because we work with adults, and, you know, we all have different backgrounds and experiences. So if we're thinking about that level of cortisol and being able to calm that, then the thinking happens a lot easier, and children are much more relaxed and can talk much more freely. So think about the conversations you have with people when you're having a coffee with them. It's just easy, relaxed. You say what you think. When you think it, you say it. You know, it's no problem. But when you are in a situation where you might feel a little threatened, or you're having to speak to a superior or an Ofsted inspector, perhaps, you know, things go out of your head, out of your mind. So the breath is a good way to bring all that down. And there's scientific and research evidence about the value of breathing deeply, because it stimulates the blood flow into your brain and calms all that cortisol, almost washes the cortisol out. So having some deep breaths, you know, people say take a breath. It actually really is true. You know, take a breath before you're going to say something like that.
And being prepared, and going back to what I was saying, being prepared and being confident also helps. I feel in that situation, well, in all situations, I suppose. Well, I've just realised I'm sitting in the dark. I wasn't expecting it to get dark. Oh, you're still here. I would have put a light on. So I do apologise for that, everybody, but you can still see me. And thank you very much for coming. And please contact either Kathy or I if we can help you in any way. Hold on.
Hi, everyone.